Well, thank you for asking me. I'm trying to not be a retired art history teacher, so here I go. I'm starting with what we call the cave paintings. I know you've seen them a million times, but there are a couple of things I want to point out. Besides God, these were really the first artists that we know of and have records of. The paintings were done. These are from Chauvet in France. Also, I'm using Lascaux next in France, and they're done by what we think are Cro-Magnon people, male, female, and children. They're handprints that let us know that there were all ages and sizes there. And they were done for several different reasons, we think. Now, historians and archaeologists and anthropologists have analyzed them, and the major concept is that, or the major belief is that they were done for some sort of ritual to preserve the herd, to make the herd larger, the more they repeat it, the more animals will be out there. They're migratory people, they're hunters, they're gatherers, and this ritual would encourage the herd to multiply. Also, it's a way to show dominance over the animal, that they're smarter than the animal and have some control over them. And of course, they want this multiplication because their life and food depend on it. What we look at there we go, in art history adds one more thing to it. If you think about this cave and, their access to caves, their use of the cave, they had to draw and paint these animals from memory. And this required acute observation. They saw the animals outside. They probably saw some every day. And they came in the caves and recreated them. And this is really challenging to do, to have an animal, even for me, to have an image in my head and create it without looking at the image. And we call this painting from observation naturalism. And that's an art history term that really starts with the cave paintings. And we can see it in all of them. They're so creative, and different colors, different patterns. We see arrows, what appears to be an arrow here, possibly an upside down figure here. There were some figures. It's interesting because the animals are so, I'll say, realistic or recognizable, and the people are stick figures for the most part. So they didn't actually look or reproduce or create themselves in this, probably because of the capture and the concept, the dominance. But this Chinese horse, if you know anything about Chinese and Asian art, you know the fluidity of the line. And I think that's why I was given this title. It also appears to be pregnant, which is, another one of their missions is in reproducing the herd. I love this one. This is so sophisticated, I can't even believe it. I want you to look at the horse's legs, and there was a debate for years over whether a horse running had all 4 feet off the ground or 2 feet on the ground. And if you see most paintings of horses, they have 4 feet on the ground. They're standing there. And look at these images. And in the 19th century, a photographer named Edward Murbridge did a series of photographs with his camera showing the horse running. And these are exactly the images in the cave paintings. Particularly these two, if you look at them. So we're so keen on their vision. This is a different kind of are very static. This is Egyptian. T was an official of Cheops. Cheops was the fourth dynasty, Old Kingdom pharaoh who started the pyramids and the largest one. And this was one of his officials. So he had his own tomb. And the hippopotamus was a very dangerous animal. It ate not only crops, but it was really aggressive. And one of the games or sports in Egypt was hunting the hippopotamus. And again, this is dominance over animals and survival, and yet sport. And so in his cave was this beautiful, this is a limestone relief painted of T on a boat with assistants, slaves, and in this hunt. And because in the afterlife, it was important for the person, the pharaoh, the scribe, the wife, whoever it was, to continue life with the enjoyment that they had on earth. But it's just an amazing image. And we know that in Egyptian art, you have this composite view of the figure from the side and from the front to show the whole body. So I'm moving now, I'm jumping from the 3000s, 2000s BCE to the Garden of Eden. This is, according to our Bible or our beliefs, it is about October 23rd, 4004 was supposedly the date of the creation of Adam. And in the Jewish Bible, it's 3761 BCE. So I'm showing this sort of, my images are in chronological order, more or less, but I want you to think about how you just in your head would imagine the Garden of Eden. I mean, is it full of everything under the sun? Is it full of two of everything? This seems to have a lot of pairs. And Adam and Eve are way back here. She's reaching for something on the tree. So they're not nearly as important. This is a Netherlands artist from Brussels, Jan Bruegel, and we'll see work by his father, Peter Bruegel, the elder, also. This is early Baroque, and it's obviously filled with a lot of things under the sun. So it's interesting. I tried to find images of just the Garden of Eden without Adam and Eve before they were created, but I didn't have much luck. Everything has Adam and Eve in it. This is my favorite image of Eve, and it also includes the landscape, the use of the landscape in telling the story. This is high medieval. This is from the Romanesque Church of Saint Lazare in Autun. Autun, this cathedral is on the path to Vézelay in Santiago, the pilgrimage path. And this is one of the scariest cathedrals in terms of imagery. In the front tympanum, the western entrance, is Christ in the Last Judgment. And on one side are the wicked and the ones going to hell, and it's grim with monsters. And on the other side are the ones going to heaven. And this is a church where the penitent came to be relieved of their sins, forgiven of their sins, on the north portal, not the west. And this is from the north portal, and you can see that Eve is, I'm going to use the word crawling, slinking along. This is the right hand and the left hand, knowing who's doing what. Her left hand's reaching for the fruit, and her right hand is covering her face. So she is aware of what she's doing. She's aware that she's sinning, and she's going to do it anyway. And where are we all in that? You know, how many times do you gossip and say, I shouldn't have done that, or ignored somebody who needed help? And you know, so it brings up, you know, reality for us. And she's also hidden. her private area by this leaf branch type shape. And this artist, Gisli Burtis, his name is Under the Feet of Christ on the front tympanum. He's one of the few artists, architects and sculptors that we know of that we know his name in this period of medieval art, because most of the structures and the carvings and the illuminations and all were done in monasteries, and you were done, it was to the glory of God, and you were not important as the artist. So this is unusual in that respect. And this north portal is where the pilgrims would confess their sins, probably with money, the indulgences. That's how the cathedrals were built. So in a way, it's not horrible. So Stonehenge, you all know about that. This use of the land, this dominance of the land with these megaliths, post and lintel construction. This is a circle / horseshoe shape. It was constructed or built over 1,500 years, from 3,000 to 1,500. And it was a place of ceremony. It had to do with burial and ritual. And it also was a solar observation for people. These were agrarian people. We're in the Neolithic period now, to tell what time of day it was and also what time of year. So I'm sure probably everybody here has been there or knows about it. I'll tell you a funny story. I was there with my mother in Salisbury to see the cathedral. And I said, I really want to go to Stonehenge. And I knew it was on Stonehenge, Salisbury Plain. And I thought we could walk there. Well, no, we asked and took a taxi. The taxi drive was forever. And this is surrounded, by the way, of mounds, burial mounds. As you approach it, they're huge mounds, multiples of them. Moving now into the Second Palace period in Crete. This is an island 24 miles long, between the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean, surrounded by both. And it was discovered, I'm sure other archaeologists found it also, but Arthur Evans is given the credit for discovering it and also for reconstructing it, which now preservation is frowned at. But all of okay, so think of an island. It had no fortifications. The ocean or the bays were it. They were seafaring people. They were supposedly very, very friendly, non-aggressive. There were no signs of tools or implements or defensive weapons found there. And all of the murals are either rituals. The bull was considered sacred, so there are a lot of images of this, and this is fresco. But look at these dolphins. This tells us that they're playful. They perform. They're frescoes of grandstands with people watching an event. So we're looking at the love of the sea, the connection of the sea, bringing their environment out there into their homes and residences. And this was multi-story. The rooms surrounded a courtyard. It was a functioning environment, really community for more than one family. Homer described it as having 30 small villages in this compound. And this is one more piece that I just think is amazing from Crete, found at Knossos, the harvester vase. And if you look at these happy people, they've harvested, they have their size, and they're singing. Here's the leader with his mouth open and a rabble up here, and here are all the followers, the singers, with their mouths open and their chests expanded. And it's just an amazing, and this is 4.5 inches tall. Imagine doing that. Steel light is really hard. And moving now to Babylon, maybe you recognize the Hanging Gardens. These were done in the Second Babylonian period under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar II, and done for his wife, Amethyst, who was from Iran. And the area of Babylon is on the Tigris, Euphrates, and closer to borders Iraq and Syria. And she was very homesick. And the story was that he decided to have the gardens built for her. And of course, this is lush, lush area. They are one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. And there's only one of those seven left. You know what it is? Pyramids. Yeah. Yeah. This is another image, and I don't know who did these, how old they are, whatever. I don't know anything about the image, but we can see here also the Tower of Babel, which was also built under Nebuchadnezzar. And the gardens were supposedly terraced like a ziggurat with steps up as you get higher. He also had his palace gated and surrounded by a wall. This is called the Ishtar Gate. Ishtar was the goddess of love, sex, and war, and very similar to Aphrodite if you want to compare it to a Greek other than the war. But these are beautiful blue. This is brick of all things. It's painted and glazed brick, and there are three animals, dragons, lions, and what's the other one? Anyway, there's another one. And they are, glazed brick is painted brick with a glass covering, glass over it. I don't know how they did them, but this is restored in the Berlin now museum. But they're just amazing. And this, of course, these animals, unlike others we've seen, are done for protection. They're not for food, they're not for capturing. They're being used to, or believed that they protect this palace. Moving to Greece. So when you think of Greece, when I think of Greece, you might think of food. I think of the Acropolis. And the Acropolis, is temples. It's statues to gods. There are many gods of nature there. Zeus, Apollo, Dionysus, Artemis, the list goes on. But the structures, their focus was really on architecture, the temples to worship the gods, on their athletes, and on war, on protecting Athens. And later, after the Peloponnesian War, the Corinthian column was created. It was really a replacement for the interior of the temples and the buildings, the mausoleums, whatever they were building at the time. And it replaced the Ionic. And we have, the columns are the Doric, which is the fatter plain column, and then the Ionic with the ram's head, and then the acanthus, which is sprouting from the base of the column or the top of the column, these acanthus leaves. And we know that almost everything in Greece was painted. The statues on the Parthenon were painted. Lots of pieces, cornice work in the detail of the temples was painted in. This is a painted Corinthian column, which is hard to believe, but anyway, there are actually colors still left on a lot of the sculptures, so they know what they. Lots of reds and blues. I was just there, so. Moving to Rome, thinking of Rome. We think first of things like the Colosseum, right? The Forum, the big architectural elements, the arches to the various emperors. And also in Rome, there were a lot of houses preserved, and particularly as we move on south to Pompeii. But this is the palace of Livia and Augustus in Prima Porta. Prima Porta was a little suburb north of and not very far, I think 10 miles or something, north of Rome. And parts of it are still there, a lot of foundation. But this particular room was preserved or stood the test of time. And it has wall murals. And this was very popular in Rome, also in Greece. But in Greece, there are no, or I've never seen any preserved paintings that were in the homes. The homes in Greece were basically the same, with the big atrium and the rooms around the outside, usually with no windows, and the light in the water and the atmosphere coming in from the opening in the atrium, which is what you see here. And this room was 20 by 40, and it was used for dining. And it was a little subterranean for cooling, because Rome is hot in the summer. And I want to show you, you can see a little bit of this is before the renovation of it. But here's what the wall looked like. So because they had no windows, they wanted to see nature and also be protected. And it was important to not be murdered. So this whole wall was surrounded by this vegetation. And there are 24 different species here of birds and plants. And also, there's one other sort of significant detail about it as far as art and painting goes, is it has perspective. It has an atmospheric perspective where objects closer to us are bigger and in more detail, brighter in color. And as that vegetation recedes into space, it becomes a little absorbed by the atmosphere. So that's either called aerial perspective or atmospheric perspective in art. But it's very sophisticated, and I'm sure it was very beautiful for the time. And all the Roman houses were decorated with scenery, or either copying of patterns like brick and marble on the walls. This is from the second style of wall painting. This left image, the Met would not give me a good slide that was in focus, but this is it. The second style is different panels, and for the most part, they are landscapes or scenes outside, whether it's a tholos, whether it was a stoa, a fountain. The one on the right is a detail that's in that section. And this has been moved to the Met. So you can go to the Met and actually go in this room. The first style was imitation of textures like marbles and bricks and stone and things like that. And this was the second. The third was heavily mirrored and heavily framed. And the fourth was crazy. It was like museum framing. If you've seen the old pictures of the Louvre, when all the paintings were just on the wall. So, but this is, Pompeii and Herculaneum. We know a lot about their life and what's preserved through the wall paintings and the ash in Pompeii and the volcanic mud in Herculaneum. So I guess I want to say that's fortunate, although it's very sad. I also want to point out that while we're here, the timeline of this, the eruption was 79 AD or CE. And I like to think that Christ, the Gospels might have been written by then, certainly Acts of the Apostles, I think. And then Jerusalem had been destroyed 7 years before the eruption of the volcano. So I like to kind of think of a timeline of other things going on at the same period of this elaborate wealth in Pompeii that didn't last. Moving now to, we've had the birth of Christ and the resurrection, and into the catacombs in Rome. Priscilla was a early Roman follower of Christianity, and particularly of Peter. She also provided Peter's headquarters when he was in Rome. And this is from her catacomb, which also included other people buried there that were, I don't even know that she would have had to know them, but it's one of the largest and best preserves. And the shepherd with the figure with the shepherd is really a pagan image, but it was a way in early Christianity to represent Christ as our shepherd without being too literal because of the executions of Christians. So it was a way to show him all the Christians knew this was Christ, but it really wasn't anything that was confrontational. But you can see just the beauty and the sensitivity here. This is fresco and on the ceiling. In 425, Honorius, who was the emperor of a failing Rome, being hit with lots of war and destruction, moved the empire to Milan first and then to Ravenna. And thank goodness, because in Ravenna we have the most amazing churches and mosaics from the early Christian period. And this is the mausoleum of Galla Placidia. That was his sister, who was also regent there in Ravenna. And this church is Greek cross style. It's based on Roman architecture. The center inside has a dome under what looks like a tower. And then each side is identical with a big Roman barrel arch. And this is in one of those barrel arches. The entire church inside is mosaic. And this is an example of early Christian churches where they were plain on the outside and rich on the inside and spiritual on the inside. And this is how the early Christian was supposed to be. Plain on the outside, don't show off your fancy stuff, and yet have your strong spirituality, your beauty inside. This is a two-part landscape. It is, first of all, from observation, from memory, the lambs, the vegetation. It's called a fully realized landscape. And yet, once the halo is put on Christ, it becomes spiritual. So this is a period after most of the persecutions that Christianity is more front and center. You start to see Christ as a shepherd, but with a halo. So he's clearly identified. And he's also in royal robes, golden, purple. But this is just an incredible, and mosaics really took over from wall painting. They were obviously more permanent. Still there, all of this. I'm also introducing a little bit of Islamic art because this is significant in terms of vegetation and nature. This is a Dome of the Rock. This was built, how many years? Muhammad died in 632. This is the Islamic or Muslim presence in Jerusalem. This is when they seem to occupy Jerusalem. And yet this Arabic script says that Jews and Christians are welcome. So you can see all of these vegetal signs, lots of leaves, little flowers, and they're actually jewels in here. So this is the Dome of Heaven. And the Islam did not believe in creating or showing figures except outside of the mosque. So in the mosque, you won't see anything but plant life and pattern and gold. In a similar way is this carpet page from Lindisfarne Gospels. This is the carpet page is the page in between in the gospel book. It's in between the portrait of the gospel writer, like say Matthew's portrait, and then there's the carpet page, and then there's the text. And this is full of little, I'm sure you can't really see them, but they're little kind of snake-like animals with heads that are wound around. And there are birds in here. There are other little tiny animals. I don't know what they are. But this whole complicated area is supposed to be spiritual. And this tight network. We know a name, Edfrith, who was a monk there and a bishop, and it's believed that he did this, which is pretty incredible. But a very famous piece. Lindisfarne is an island, northeast England near the Scottish border. Now we're moving to back to the period of Romanesque art, Romanesque bordering on Gothic, to the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, and to the gospel story, not gospel story, to the story of St. Francis that is in 28 panels, that is in this is it, that runs around the church. This is the upper church. The lower church is the crypt, which was discovered, his crypt, discovered in 1818. So it's a very special and holy place. Here I got two different images on the internet. I don't know which is the correct color. I think probably the left one. But it's one of the stories of St. Francis. The 28 panels are the story of his teaching and of his life. And, one of his famous messages was his preaching to the birds. And this figure behind him is a Franciscan monk who has his hand up in a blessing. This is early Giotto before the Arena Chapel. So the Arena Chapel is a lot more sophisticated. I love this book, The Very Rich Hours. They were done for John, Duke of Berry, who was a French priest who commissioned it. It actually is over 200 pages. They're on vellum. And it's interesting because they had 10 colors to work from, and this is powder, of course, and they mixed them with water and added gum arabic to stiffen the color. And this is exactly what watercolor out of a tube is now. It hasn't changed. And just three ingredients: pigment, water, and gum arabic. So it's interesting, but it's a book of the different months of the year and the activities that represent that month. And this beautiful snow scene for February. There were two brothers, Paul and John, and they took turns doing different months of the year. You have the zodiacs up here, and the lunar, however you read the lunar calendar, is here. And this could be any year. It was not specific to year. It was just specific to month. But they're just charming. And sadly, in 1416, both brothers died of the plague before the complete book was finished. And Book of Hours, of course, is prayers and devotions. Everyone's familiar with this. One of the miracles of nature, because Venus was born from the sea. She washed in on a conch shell and is greeted by the zephyrs, the winds, and Flora, who has a draper. So this is so spring and so about creation, really, even though a myth. Her posture is taken from Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Cnidos, if you know that classical 4th century BC sculpture. She was a model. Her face is used in other Botticelli images. And this was commissioned by the Medici. The Medici, along with commissioning amazing Christian art, were huge Platonic worshipers and even wrote Platonic poetry. So the pagan stories were very important to them and to their palace decoration also. So how beautiful could this be? This is Albert Dürer. He was German. This is high Renaissance, comparable in time to Da Vinci and Michelangelo. And he did a lot of paintings, some religious. He did an amazing portrait of himself that I'm sure you've seen, but he was an incredible watercolorist. And his mother-in-law set up a print shop for him and sold his prints. And he was also extremely wealthy. And this is, the printing press had been invented at this point. But I think this piece is so gorgeous and certainly an honoring of one of God's creatures. So you're starting to see different motivations for the creation or the representation of nature. This is the Louvre version of the Madonna of the Rocks, Da Vinci's, and there was also one in the National Gallery in London, and which I don't think is nearly as appealing as this one. This one was done first. This is a representation of the Madonna with the Christ child and John the Baptist and the angel Uriel on the flight into Egypt, and they are hiding. We don't know exactly about that. They are hiding in this grotto, which is perfect for escaping anyone looking for you. And also it brings up a lot about Da Vinci and his style. So one of the things, we all know he's a polymath and he was interested in everything that ever existed, including geology. And this grotto is going back to creation, to the early creation of the earth and the world. And, the very oldest part of nature that can be. And thus a place of hiding, of mystery, of darkness for the Virgin and protection. And it also, if you look carefully, there's a style in art called chiaroscuro, which is the careful blending of dark to light. When we see that smooth skin that he's done on many of his figures, particularly Gianello da Vinci in the National Gallery, that would be chiaroscuro. And yet with Da Vinci, he takes it a step further into sfumato. And sfumato is where, see how John the Baptist's arm, the back of it just disappears into the back of this cape of cloth. Hers does too, the back of her head. It's almost like a smokiness that surrounds some of his figures and just blends them into this mysterious world of this grotto. This brings up, everybody's familiar with the temptation and expulsion from the Sistine Chapel, but it brings up a lot about Christian paintings, biblical paintings. Biblical paintings were done to tell a story. And so they were predominantly about the figure, and the landscape was incidental and didn't much matter. We have just enough here to give us the information we need, like the tree of knowledge, the rocks they could lean against, and not much else. You remember that in the Sistine Chapel, the earlier images, I think 3 or 4 of Michelangelo were very crowded, and when he got down and looked at them, and people commented, they said, it's just hard to make them out. And so he started clearing them out, making the background, we call it, more simple, so that they could be read easier from the floor. But anyway, this is that story. There's one thing I want to point out. We saw it a little bit in Eve at Autun, but I think it hadn't really fully started then. But in the 12th century, the serpent started having the face of a woman instead of a snake. So here you see the serpent with the female face, which, anyway. This is a carpet this is from Iran, and it is full of figures and animals. I don't know, you're welcome to come up and look at it closely if you can't see it. And these animals are kind of in a tub. There's some on top of each other. There's some biting at each other's leg, but it's amazingly playful. There are figures here and here on their sides. Everything from, these look like goats, lions, rabbits, just tons of, striped animals, but in this very elaborate carpet that is strongly about nature. Moving now to the late Renaissance in Brussels. This is Peter Bruegel the Elder. He is the father of Jan, who painted the Garden of Eden. And this is a little bit different take because this is about an artist's experience, about his life. This is what he does. He hunts, he lives here, he knows these people. One of those houses is probably his. And he did more than five. Five have been preserved or saved or found of different times of the year, not necessarily months, but just different seasons of the year. And this one is, I just think it's so charming. And Northern Renaissance was a little behind the Southern Renaissance, meaning Florence and Italy and France. And their work was a little less blended. It was a little more defined, a little more detailed than Southern Renaissance, which was more like what you saw with Michelangelo or with Da Vinci's Virgin. This is the same artist, if you can imagine. This is small, 14 by 21, a lot of detail in for something that size. And the flight into Egypt. And here, the landscape takes over, doesn't it, from the biblical story. You can barely make out Joseph. Mary is holding Christ like this to her chest. And then we have this sort of magical, imaginary landscape that doesn't appear to look like the Egypt we know, right? But perhaps that's the Nile, and we're seeing that pattern of it. But these spiky mountains, but I think it's meant to set a mood of mystery and perhaps danger and darkness, and they don't know where they're going, right? The distance between Jerusalem and the Egyptian border is about 60 or 70 miles, but we don't know where they went. And at this time, Cleopatra had died, and the governing of Egypt was more under Roman rule, and that's the same Roman rule of Herod. So I don't really get why they went to Egypt, but anyway, it is quite a scene with this almost prehistoric, primitive, primeval landscape. And everybody knows I'm comparing this to Hunters in the Snow. Everybody's grandmother had one of these, right, framed. And I remember seeing somewhere that it was a calendar. They had, Curry and Ives had calendars of these are lithographs. Curry and Ives are a printing company, but I think this is certainly popular. And a glorification really of nature in the winter and the activities and the enjoyment of it. We're kind of turning the corner now into real landscape, what I consider landscape as a subject. This is 1600, 17th century. This is called the Golden Age of Dutch art. It is the age of Vermeer and Rembrandt, and this is Jacob Ruysdael. And in Haarlem, well, most of the Netherlands, northern Netherlands, was flat. And Haarlem was known for its bleaching fields. So no matter where linen was bleached, was manufactured or woven, if it was bleached in Haarlem, and it had a tag on it that said bleached in Haarlem, it was worth more. So these were commissioned pieces by dealers and manufacturers of linen. And linen is also biblically considered an image of purity. And in the lands, because the land is so flat, you have more sky there, or it's represented. Almost all the landscapes done in this period have enormous skies. And he's been very sneaky, Ruysdael, about putting in St. Bavo Church. And this was a Protestant church. And, in the Netherlands, there's northern and southern Netherlands. Northern is Protestant and southern is Catholic. And Bavo was a very wealthy nobleman who gave up all his money and became a hermit and is the patron saint of Haarlem. So hence the name of the church is Bavo. But I love that he placed it there. This is my first piece of architecture having to do with nature and landscape. And this is the beautiful Villa Rotunda by Palladio. This is Renaissance, late Renaissance in Italy. And it is modeled after Vitruvius. Vitruvius, the first century Roman architect, wrote 12 books of architecture, which I've been told by architectural students, they still look at it and study. And then Palladio wrote 4. And they're based on, obviously, a temple. They have, this one has obviously the dome, the rotunda in the center, and each of the entrances, the facades, are identical, and they're based on a Greek or Roman temple with the pediment, the cornices, and the columns. And they were all strategically placed. There are 24 of them in Vicenza and smaller areas outside of Rome. There were the wealthy Romans. This must have cost a fortune. If you look it up and look at the interior, it's all different marbles and, extremely elaborate. But they were all placed on little high spots with a view out every door. So you could go to any side of it. You could open it up and the breeze went through, and they were considered the ultimate of where to live. This is a UNESCO World Heritage stuff. There are 23 buildings of his in Vicenza in addition to these villas, but it's a villa, a home location and view. And you all know this, the Baroque classical Versailles, home of Louis XIV, and these formal gardens. This is the first we've seen of the layout of very tightly groomed landscaping. And here is the view even tighter. Very appealing, very dramatic. The patterns are beautiful. And this is a little different. In the Enlightenment period, which is the 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, it was very popular, particularly in England. If you had an estate, if you were a baron or a duke or something, you had a lot of land, to have it look naturally groomed. And because of their focus on the revival of the classical, they had classical monuments, aqueducts, that's an imitation of the Pantheon, built on their property. They would have tea out there or walk over them. Or, this was wealthy leisure. And but very popular, and this is all still there. This is my relief image for you. I'm not a good gardener, but I have one peony bush that I planted in 2014, and it has one peony a year. Seriously, every year. And this is the peony. And I've asked myself repeatedly why it only has one. And I decided that she likes all the attention. So, but isn't she beautiful? And the center is, if I pulled all those petals apart, the center is yellow and even prettier. So, going to America now. So, you know, we had the Revolutionary War. The major form of art was portraits. They were fairly primitive, of different important people that had settled mostly in Massachusetts and the upper Northeast and New York. But Thomas Cole moved here from England when he was a young man, about 10. He had a very short life, but he painted this landscape. The American wilderness was so appealing because Europe, of course, didn't have wilderness like we did. This is the Connecticut River, and the oxbow is a pattern that the river makes where it makes a turn and banks itself in, basically. There is a figure of him. You can see it in the real painting down here. He's right there. But you can see this interest in the storm and the landscape, in how weather affects debris, the fallen tree, obviously been through some kind of trauma. And yet these fields that seem to be cultivated and starting to bloom out in spring. I'm going to talk about him later, so keep him in mind. His comparable artist in England was John Constable, and he actually met John Constable when he went on one of his European trips in 1829. And Constable, unlike Cole, who traveled, Constable stayed in England his entire life. He never went to Italy or France or anywhere else. And he painted mostly this area of the Store River. His father was a wealthy landowner. He owned a barge company. And basically, Constable grew up as a wealthy squire who didn't have to work and could paint. But his paintings are just so exceptional. He and Turner are probably the most well-known and well-loved of the early 19th century landscape painters. But this Haywain is part of where he lived. This house is part of the estate. And he did painting after painting of this. And you might notice the clouds. He was hugely involved and loved cloud paintings, and I'll show you some sketches in a minute. He also is, and I'm sure you probably have seen it, the painter of two versions of the Salisbury Cathedral that are very well known. Here are his cloud studies. And Thomas Cole said one thing that he learned from Constable was to do an oil sketch, which he'd never done. One more thing, back to Constable. In Constable, you can't really see it here, but these little white spots around the light, this is thick paint. And that implies looser paint. You know, less control, less blending, they putting on the little highlights in the water. And this is starting to loosen up the concept of the blending and the perfection of the Renaissance. And you'll see it just start to snowball here in a minute. Another subject that was popular in the 1600s, this is also the Netherlands. Claire Peters lived in Antwerp but painted in Harlem, and I'm wondering if that was a religious reason. But anyway, what you would do with these paintings were for dining rooms. And in the Netherlands, the the Netherlands was extremely wealthy at this point. There was the East Dutch India Company in the West, and they had tons of money, tons of trade. The first stock exchange was set up for them in Amsterdam, and money was flowing. The rich were super rich. The middle class could afford this, and this was not cheap. And they were very popular. They were considered, a lot of them were considered wedding portraits because in the case of this one, the coins and the knife were used to identify the time of the painting, the era sort of. And the name of the person it was for was usually on flatware, silverware, on some object. And then, did you have a question? But anyway, you can see the elaborateness of this. And my question is, how did they keep everything alive when, they were painting and I guess just doing it in sections? Because this is before photography. There's a show now at the Frick on Gainsborough, and the subject is fashion, fashion. Gainsborough said one of his favorite quotes is, "This cursed face again." He disliked painting portraits, and that's what we know him for, right? Now, you can figure why you would dislike painting portraits, because you've got to deal with the person, and the person is really worried about their hair and how they look and what they're wearing and what position they're in, and their hand is too small, etc. And it was a great strain on him, and all he wanted to do was paint landscapes. And I think that when you look at Mrs. Richard Brinsley Sheridan, you can sense his love of nature. She was Elizabeth Linley. She was a soprano, a well-known soprano. And when she married Richard Brinsley Sheridan, he forbid her to sing. This was not uncommon. Women weren't supposed to work if they were married. And she was incredibly sad. I think she looks very pensive and melancholy here. And she died at age 38, unhappy. So, but it's an incredible. He had this style of like flighty clothes. Everything seemed lightweight and sheer, including the landscape. Moving to France and to the honoring, I guess I'll put it that way, of animals, of the beast. Rosa Bonheur's father was an artist. He was also a socialist. He believed in the strength of women. He encouraged her to be an artist when you couldn't even go to art school at the academies yet. And she disliked living in Paris because she said it was dirty and noisy and crowded and full of disease. And so she moved to Fontainebleau, which is in the Barbizon area, and this Nivernais, the canal, goes through there or near there. And this plowing the Nivernais says so many things. First of all, she thought that animals were our equal and had as much soul, spirit, credit as human beings. And this beautiful scenery is a lot about the animal, the power of the oxen, their struggle to work hard, and also about agriculture, about the need for planting, for feeding us, for feeding them, and for peace. There was no smog here. This was beautiful country, blue sky, and her paintings were huge. She has one called The Horse Fair at the Met, and it's, this is where horses were sold. It's unbelievable. But she lived in a man's world in a lot of ways. So, Joseph Mallard, William Turner. Did anyone see the movie Turner? Well, you know where I'm coming from then. Turner was a so interested in light and weather. And if anything could blow or move, he loved to paint it. And when the Houses of Parliament caught on fire, this is 1834, he got in a boat with an easel and started painting. He painted some from the bank of the Thames and some from the boat. And this is just incredible. And this, of course, is this fire that was started by two people working that put tally sticks, which I don't really understand what they are, in a furnace, and they got too hot. The copper inside the lining melted, and the whole Westminster Palace caught on fire. So anyway, but this was, I'm sure, incredibly exciting for him. And he had a looser style than Constable. He was Constable's arch enemy, and likewise, they came from two different philosophies of art. Here's another Turner. This is rain, steam, and speed. And we're looking east at London, and the train is moving west. And this is an important scene because the Great Western Railroad had just come to Europe, and the French were wild over it. And they could get out of Paris and travel to the suburbs or wherever the railroad went. But I think here you see this consuming of nature, of steam, rain, which we have no control over. And yet this moving vehicle that is powered by steam just proceeding forward. So there's a lot of contrast in here. Turner also in the movie, and this is, I don't know if this is true or not, I looked it up, but I don't think it's ever been decided. He had himself strapped to the mast of a boat, a ship, and put out to sea in a storm so that he could feel the rain and the wind beating against him, and he would know how to paint.
Winslow Homer did the same thing.
Yeah. And I've got Winslow's.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. This is a German painter, Caspar David Friedrich. He just had a huge show last March at the Met that I saw. And the interesting thing about this is the same consuming nature of just the power of nature and the many facets and colors and movement that it has. And the monk, it's interesting because usually when there are figures in a painting, they're either in profile or they're looking at us. And the monk here has his back to us. So we're seeing what the monk saw, or the monk is seeing what we're seeing. So it's a little different. And there's a lot of terror in Turner sometimes, and also in Friedrich. They're of that ilk that they want to show something dangerous and frightening to spur the thought, our thoughts. So talking about light and weather, we can talk about smog and steam. This is Claude Monet, one of the earlier paintings of his. And this is when the first sheds were built, train stations for the trains coming into Paris. And they were metal. This was an early use of metal. They were open because of all this moisture and steam. They were filthy, as you can imagine. But this train was able to get the Parisians who, at this point, this is after the Prussian War. It's under the rule of Napoleon III, and it's when he had Haussmann, Baron Haussmann, basically destroy most things old and crummy in Paris and build these beautiful boulevards and these tall 6-story classical apartment buildings with the mansard roofs, you see what here, to make Paris appealing and rich, and people were getting richer and life was more leisurely, hence the subject matter for Impressionism. So this all kind of feeds into a bigger story where art is moving. Staying with Monet, he did 20 images of the Houses of Parliament in different light. This one was in fog, They're in various, some are dark at night, some are in bright sun where it almost disappears. He actually had a room at Savoy and painted from there, set up his easel. That must have been expensive. It would be now. And his haystacks are another one of his long series. There's Rouen Cathedral, there's just a slew of them, of course, the water lilies. And here we have snow and sun. You know, Impressionism is interesting because it with Monet particularly, it was about light, about the changes of weather, the change on light in an object, light disintegrating an object. And a lot of most of the Impressionists, it also broke up color. You really didn't have solid colors in Impressionist paintings. They were all dabs of colors that the eye would blend. So examples here. Back to just flashing through Cole. The one thing I want to say about Cole is he, in his short life, started a school of painting in the Northeast called the Hudson River School. And this is some of the most beautiful landscape painting of America that you would ever see. And he was the founding father of this school. And Asher Brown, he goes by Asher B. Duran in his signatures. This is idealized landscape based on the Catskills, the Adirondacks, and the White Mountains. And there was photography by now. They used cameras. They could use cameras. I'm not sure the extent of it, but the camera, the daguerreotype, was in use in 1839, and then as photography proceeded on to Eastman, the Kodak camera was 1888. I didn't realize it was that old, but they had access to photography, so they could do oil sketches, take photographs, and paint in their New York studios. One other of Asher B. Duran's that is really popular is Kindred Spirits. And he was very close to Thomas Cole, who founded this school of painters. And also there were a lot of poets and literary people involved in this. And one was William Cullen Bryant. And he was asked when Cole died at a young age to do a portrait of Bryant and Cole together because they were really best friends. So this is it. Again, this is idealized. But I also want to point out that this is the era of transcendentalism and pantheism. With Cole particularly, this believing that God is nature and nature is God. And then, of course, transcendentalism is a belief in not only self-reliance, but in having your own spiritual religion. And it's a philosophy of a thought of different thinking. And I don't know if any of you read any of the essays by Louisa May Alcott about her father and his commune, but he was one of the followers of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau. So this is their era. This is so you can really kind of sense that as you look at the landscapes of this period. Okay, here we go. Rebecca